Well, good morning and welcome back to our course on the Exodus. And I would like to just share with you that I've enjoyed teaching in this particular style over these weeks. We trust it won't be too many for the sake of those that are suffering with this virus. But I'm happy to teach and happy to share with you what the Lord teaches me during the week. We're in a course about the God who reveals himself. And we're seeing this through a series of pictures as God takes the children of Israel on the Exodus. This morning, we're going to turn to Exodus 24, and we'll start looking at the first 8 verses. Now, remember, last week we saw as the Lord gave the 10 Commandments to Moses and then some other various items that were related to how Israel was to live. And we saw the beginning of the covenant. I'm going to call that the covenant with a small c, because today we're going to see the covenant with the big C, that is the fully ratified covenant and all of the things that go into that. And I think you'll find out very quickly what I mean by that. Exodus 24:1. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules, and the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words that the Lord has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose up early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now we begin to see right here that this is a little bit different than the covenant statement with a small c. In that statement, God established the principle of obedience. He wasn't giving the children of Israel all of the details. Of course, he did give Moses the 10 Commandments. And the main point of that covenant with a small c was to establish the principle of obedience, that the people were willing to follow God's leadership. That's the starting point. But the actual Mosaic covenant, as it's understood by scholarship and in the scriptures, is found here as we talk about it today with a capital C. And as you noticed when I read this introductory passage, we have some different things going on. We have the book of the covenant, which I'll talk about in a minute. We have an altar and sacrifices going on, and we have pillars, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So let's talk about that and get this unpacked, and then we will move on to the other parts of this particular ceremony that goes with the covenant. First, the book of the covenant. What was that, you might say? Well, the statement here is that Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. Now keep in mind, we haven't gotten to the table of stones yet, either one of them. But God has already given the 10 Commandments and a few other things related to the sacrificial system and order in the people of Israel and so on and so forth. And there, of course, are the different things that God said to Moses in the line of all of this. And so Moses begins to write. I wouldn't be surprised if this were the beginning of the writing that he did when he penned the words of the book of Moses, of Deuteronomy, for instance, and Exodus. This was Moses writing about this. So he begins to write down all of the things that God had said. And he puts them in a book, a journal, if you please, we use today's term. And he begins to write these things down. And it's called the Book of the Covenant. We'll see that in just a few minutes. But the book really is a compendium of all of the parts, the wherefores, the what's, ands, ifs, buts of the covenant. It's all there in detail so that it can be read in the future. That's how they did legal covenants. They would have a ceremony, but they would have a document in which all of the conditions are stated and are all laid out so that nobody could doubt it. In fact, interestingly, later on when we see the tables of stone, the first time that God writes them, it makes the statement that he writes them on the front and on the back of those stones. And that is because the custom was, whether it was a stone or papyri or whatever it was that the covenant was written on, they would write on both sides of it so that if one side got messed up or partially covered, you would have the document on the other side to prove that this was legal and that it was correspondent to the original statements. So Moses is writing. Moses is writing. Now, we also have the sacrifice. Remember, this had not been a sacrificial system yet. All that was to come with the giving of the details of the law. But yet, this was one of those things that we've spoken of before that was rather universal, like the Sabbath, which occurred right immediately following the creation. And sacrifices were part of what they did to ratify covenants. And in this case, the whole redemption of Israel was based on the blood covenant, first at the Passover, and then as it was replicated through various sacrifices in their history, to remind us, or remind them, that the sacrifice was coming in Jesus Christ, that would end all sacrifices and would be sufficient for their sins. And so, after Moses told the people all the words of the Lord, as it says here, and they answered him, he rose up early in the morning and built an I'm mixed up this morning. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain. We don't know what this altar was. There's no law yet about how it should be constructed. It could be an altar that was built up of earth. It could have been an altar that was just built up of stones piled together. I rather think that's it because that's the way it was later. But the altar is built, and it signifies that there will be a time of worship and acknowledging of their sins to God prior to this whole covenant being consecrated. The third thing that he mentions here are the pillars. 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. One pillar for each. I read some interesting speculation, and that's all it was, so I won't take a lot of time on it, but that perhaps in the building of the 12 pillars, each tribe appointed their own workmen to build their own pillar, so that it would have the identity that they wanted to show of their pillar. I don't know if that's true, but they had to be built, and the scripture does not tell us how they were built, but that they were, and they were to represent the tribes of Israel. And different times in the story of Israel, there are different symbols that are put up. There are different stones or towers or piles of rocks or different things. And each time, as God says in describing one of them, these are here so that if their children were to ask, what do those pillars mean? You could tell them the story of how God brought them out of the wilderness. And so they were meant to be a sign for the people. And so we have these remembrances, the Book of Covenant, to help them remember the terms of the covenant and to be that guide in the future. The altar and sacrifice, signifying with blood that they were trusting God to do for them what they could not do for themselves. and then the pillars to identify with the 12 tribes of Israel. And I might just make this additional comment here, and that is that as we come into this part of the story, for the first time, we have a clear identity of Israel as a nation. The scripture changes the way it talks about them and begins to talk about them as the children of Israel, or the 12 tribes of Israel. And the key word there, of course, being Israel, meaning they're one nation together unto God. Now they're going to have a ceremony, and we find this in verses 5 through 8. Let me read that with you. 24, Exodus 24, 5 through 8. And he sent young men of the people of Israel, who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of the oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. Notice that they got the message about obedience. We will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. Now, one just minor detail, well, I did look it up, and the term that's translated here in the ESV, throwing the blood on the people, really in the original Hebrew it's about sprinkling. I'm not exactly sure how they arrived at their conclusion to translate it that way, but every other source says it's sprinkling. And so there was the idea of sprinkling. Did he sprinkle it on all 1.5 million people that were there? No, I don't think so. But here again, you can kind of foresee that they had these pillars that had been placed up there by the different tribes, and perhaps the leadership of those tribes were standing near the pillars, which were next to the altar. And that perhaps as he sprinkled the altar and he sprinkled the people, he was sprinkling those leaders that were there in the front ranks, right next to the sacrifice. He had young men offer the sacrifice. Now again, we are in a situation where we're pre-law, so the group of people that were to be the ones offering sacrifices had not been named. They had not been chosen. They will be very shortly. But Moses chooses young men. And I'm going to guess, nothing that we can prove, but I'm going to guess that those young men were no doubt from his tribe, because he was of the tribe of Levi, and Levi was going to be the priest in the future. And I'm just thinking that he took those that were near, that were under his leadership in his tribe, and had them come. But it doesn't matter. They offered sacrifices, and there was the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, the meeting place between God and man, sprinkling the blood on the altar, and sprinkling the blood on the people were part of the same ceremony that said, if I don't keep the terms of this covenant, may the same thing happen to me that happened to those animals. We saw that in the Abrahamic covenant way back in the early book of Genesis. But here they are, sprinkling the blood on the altar and sprinkling the blood on the people to signify this covenant. And then finally, he was reading the terms of the covenant out of the book of the covenant. And you did notice, did you not? There in verse 5 or 6, I think it is, it says that he took the book of the covenant. Now that's capitalized, and I think it's correctly so. After we read earlier that Moses started writing all the things that God said, now it has become, quote, the book of the covenant, unquote. And this was a very, very important volume. So we had that ceremony. We had the remembrances. We have the ceremony. And, that altar and those pillars were not going to move. They were going to stay there for the sake of the children who might ask what they meant. One interesting side note here, if you look at Hebrews, or if you just listen to my reading of Hebrews 9:19, we actually have a description of the same event. Here's what it says in Hebrews. When every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's the same thing that was used on the doorposts and the lintels of the house to spread the blood when they left Egypt. But with water and with scarlet wool and with hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people. Now, that's one additional detail that we didn't catch back in Moses' writing of it, but here under the inspiration of the Spirit, we see that the people were sprinkled, and of course we saw in Exodus that the altar was sprinkled, but he says he sprinkled the book itself, and that really completes the transaction. And that's the New Testament rendering of that same event. Now, when this has happened, God is going to show for the one of two times in our lesson today his glorious presence. And in fact, the title of this lesson is I Am Glorious God. We're going to see what a wonderful person, what a beautiful person God is. And it might not be what you expect. But we're going to see that happen on two different occasions here. First, an appearance to the inner circle. There's kind of an inner circle going on here as well as a larger circle. And in verses 9 through 11 here of chapter 24, we read this: Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. Now, this is nothing more or less than fulfilling the commandment that God gave earlier. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. Now, what was it that they saw? We're not told. We're not told that they saw the Lord. He's not mentioned there. It just said they went up to the mountain and they saw God, the God of Israel, I should say, not Jehovah or Yahweh, but the God of Israel. They saw him. And then it goes right to a description that sounds eerily similar to one we know in the book of Revelation. And I think that there's very likely the probability here, that the vision that these people saw wasn't just of God of Israel, as Moses was going to see him as he went by and let him see his train in the next chapter. But this was an option that God had elected to give them a vision of him in heaven. Now, why do I say that? Well, the reason why I say that is if you go into the book of Revelation, you will find described before the throne of God the crystal sea, which is so clear that you could see, like looking up through the sky, you could see clearly in that crystal sea. That's in front of the Lord on his throne in heaven. That's exactly and only the only description of what they saw. There was under his feet a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. So I believe that he took these people, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70, and showed them who he was as a vision of heaven. And the part that we pick up from the description is this clear pavement, as it were. In the Revelation, John calls it the sea, the crystal sea. And then we have a very, very interesting statement. It says here, God did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. Well, that's very, very strange and confusing. Why did he say that? Because he wasn't yet putting his full stamp of approval on this. He did approve them by inviting them to come up into the mountain when only Moses and Aaron could do it before. But he is not laying his hand to empower them. That's not what this is about. Notice the next statement. It's one of the more remarkable statements in all of Scripture. All right, got the picture? Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, 70 men, they go up into the mountain, and God gives them a vision of himself there at the Crystal Sea, I believe. And he says, this is not about empowering them or putting my seal of approval on them. But the last thing it says there is they stood and they beheld God and they ate and drank. Now, the whole idea here is that this was for quite some time. Here they are in heaven, and they get a vision of God, and their eyes lock on that vision, and they literally cannot look away. They behold God, and they just stay there and eat and drink. Why does he say that? To show that this was over a period of time. It wasn't a glance, it wasn't a stare, it was a gaze. They were beholding him, they were watching him, they were dumbstruck. Well, I don't think you have to walk very far to understand where I'm going with this. What will be our reaction when we first get to glory and we get to see our Savior sitting on the throne? You know, I've heard different ones preach about this in different ways, how that they would fall on their faces and worship him, how that they would sing, how that they would have a joyous dance. I want to beg to differ. I think when we get there, we're going to be so awestruck that we'll just be there and we're going to look at him for a while. And we're going to look and look and look and be amazed at the glory of our God. Now, the next appearance goes beyond the inner circle. God's going to make himself known. He's going to appear to Israel. Verses 15 through 18. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And the glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. After giving the inner circle his vision of God in heaven, he comes to the mountain. He has Moses come all the rest of the way up the mountain. Remember, so much of this story is built around Moses going part way up the mountain to see God and talk to him. Israel not even knowing what was being said except for what Moses wrote. But now he's going up to the top, and God's going to come down in his full presence. And when he does, the cloud covers the mountain, and the glory, that's the bright light, of course, that led Israel at nighttime. The glory of the Lord dwelt upon their mountain for 6 days. For 6 days he let the people of Israel see himself in this huge fire and smoke. On the seventh day he called Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the appearance of it was like a devouring fire. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I think what it means is the whole top of the mountain was on fire. And it was just eating up all of the wooded areas or whatever it was. It was like having a forest fire that came in a bolt and covered the whole mountain all at once. Something they had never seen before. What was the meaning of these appearances? It was meant to show the people the majesty and the glory of God. We're going to see some details in just a few minutes. As one of my friends would say, it'll knock your socks off. We're going to see some of those things about the glory of God. But at the beginning, it's about letting people understand how glorious He is, how powerful He is, that He can do these kinds of things. Now, in chapters 25 through 31 here of this book, we have God communicating to Moses about his dwelling place on the earth. In other words, the tabernacle here at the beginning, of course. And we start off chapter 25 with a sacrifice. Let's read that. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the children of Israel that they take for me a contribution. And from every man whose heart moves him, you shall receive a contribution for me." Yes, there's time for our clock again. Take an offering. Sacrifice something of yourself, some things that you have that we can make this sanctuary with. And he says in verse 8, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." And so, chapter 25 through 30 is a detailed description of the tabernacle and how it was to be constructed. Now, why was this first among the things that God was telling them, even before the Ten Commandments and so on? Because the key issue here is that God is going to be with them. God is going to lead them. That was the promise that He made to Moses at the burning bush. "I will go with you." And so He had this promise, and He wanted to make clear to the people how this would be carried out. And so He does say, we're going to make a place, make a sanctuary for me, a tabernacle. And so I'm not going to go through the details of that because it's not germane in the specific to the lesson that we're teaching. I will say, if you're interested in the tabernacle, and especially for your children, although it is very adult in its presentation, once we get out of this virus and we can travel again, you need to go to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where there is a life-size duplicate of the tabernacle. And it's presented beautifully by some of the folks there in terms of the meaning of it. And it'd be very interesting to you and your family to see that. But it's all here in chapters 25 and following. Now, the next thing that happens is that we have, unfortunately, the rejection of this covenant. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute. 3 times in the last 2 lessons, I've heard Israel say, "What you have told us, we will do." In fact, in the last one, they said, "We got it, we will obey." Yes, that's what they said. But their hearts were not singular toward God. And so there's going to be a sad experience that probably many of you are familiar with here. We're going to go all the way to Exodus 32. And I'm going to read from that. "When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain," why did they see that he delayed? Because he was up there more than 40 days. So far, the ones that are described to us are 47 days, and he's going to be there another 40 days later. So they're getting worried. And so they said to Aaron, "Up, make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." My, how quickly people's minds can change. How quickly their heart can turn. Aaron is not free from guilt here. So Aaron says to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are on the ears of the people, on the ears of your wives, your sons, your daughters, and bring them to me." So all of the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." And they rose up early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink and rose up to play. Now, this is a terrible situation. They get impatient with Moses. And really, it starts with a rebellion. They say to Moses, "Make us a god. Make us a god." They said that to Aaron, rather. And so the second sad thing here is that they were egged on by a weak leader. Aaron says to them, "Okay, well, bring some things and I'll do it." Now, this is a kind of a mixture. They already have that first and second commandment that Moses spoke to them, and he wrote in the covenant, in the book of the covenant. They know that they are not to make images of other gods. And I suppose they're justifying this by saying, well, we're not making an image of another god, we're making an image of our God. That's the first commandment, but the second commandment says you are not to make any images of any kind to any god. So they're definitely in rebellion. And Aaron doesn't help with this. If it were not for the intervention of Moses and intercession, Aaron could have lost his life here, but God chose to forgive him later on. And then this rebellion continued with a decision. And the last thing that Israel says is, "These are our gods." These are our gods. They're identifying themselves with their gods. So it's all wrong. Instead of worrying about being on the Lord's side, they were worried about him being on their side, and they didn't see him, so they had to make a god to take his place. And it's all very, very sad. Well, Moses, God points out Israel's sin in verse 11, and he points out to Moses what they were doing. And in verses 12 and 13, Moses appeals for mercy. He says this, "Why should the Egyptians say, 'With evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains, to consume them from the face of the earth?'" He said, why should the Egyptians say that? "Turn from your burning anger and relent from this disaster against your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," or Jacob, "your servants, to whom you swore by your own self and said to them, 'I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever.'" Interestingly, when Moses goes to appeal for mercy, he appeals to God on the basis of another covenant which is unconditional. And Moses knows this. God said, "I will take my children into this land." Now, the way God's proposing to do it was to kill them all and then make a new nation out of Moses. But Moses wasn't satisfied with that, and he didn't believe that that's what God was really going to do or wanted to do or meant by his first covenant. And so he puts that unconditional covenant before the Lord as his appeal. And lo and behold, in verse 4, we see that God relents. He cannot go, will not go against his unconditional covenant that he had made earlier to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. But there's justice to be done because of this sin. And so Moses is going to execute this justice. It's found in chapter 32, verses 15 to 29, but let's just dip in here at verse 26 and get to the heart of the matter. It says, "Then Moses rose in the gate of the camp and said, 'Who is on the Lord's side? Come to me.' And all of the sons of Levi," his own tribe, gathered around him. Now you see what's happening here is that Moses, in this crisis, is beginning to differentiate on the basis of God's leadership. And he has a special role for Levi to carry on throughout the history of Israel. This is the beginning of it, but it doesn't start with sacrifice. There's a punishment in blood that must take place for Israel to get past this. And so in Exodus 32:27 we read, "And he said to him, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, Put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate throughout the camp, gate to gate throughout the camp. And each of you kill his brother and his companion of his neighbor." And the sons of Levi did according to the words of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people died. God does not distinguish to these men of Levi who they are to kill. He says, go throughout the camp and kill. Could be brothers, could be sons. Who were they? Well, God being who he is, and God being a just God, I have to believe that the ones that had been the leaders in this sin were the ones that were to be targeted, and the young men knew who they were. And so as they went through camp, they killed 3,000. 3,000 men of the people died. 3,000 people that had been involved in leading Israel into that sin. And that was the price that they paid. Now, we continue to have the story unfold for us. And as we get to 32, verses 30 to 32, you have Moses not only appealing to God's unconditional covenant to Abraham, but he's also going to make a second appeal based on the fact that they've gone throughout the land and killed these 33,000 men, paid the price. And so in his second one, Moses says this, "The next day Moses said to the people, 'You have sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin.'" What would the atonement consist of? Well, he's going to present before the Lord the blood of the 3,000 men that were killed. And so Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They have made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written." And I believe this is a first reference to the book of life. So as we are born on this earth, all of us are written into that book of life. Only those that refuse to accept Christ are blotted out. I'm thankful that I'm not blotted out from that book. But Moses hears God in his anger, and he really makes this assumption: they're going to be blotted out. These people that were killed for their sin are going to be blotted out. And he says, I want to ask you to forgive the sin, even the sin of the rest of the people that followed them, and don't blot their names out. But if you won't do that, then please blot me out of your book. In other words, if they're going to be blotted out, Lord, you might as well blot me out. Well, that's powerful stuff. And we understand that God has a response here, and it's a gracious one. And 32:34 says, but now go, God speaking, but now go, lead the people to the place about which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel shall go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I visit, I will visit their sin upon them. Then the Lord sent a plague on the people, because they made the calf, the one that Aaron made. Now it's interesting, when God first made that conditional covenant with a small c, God's covenant was about obedience. And he said, if you will obey me, I won't send any of these diseases or plagues that I gave to Egypt. Implied in that condition was, if you don't obey me, there will be plagues. And here we go. He said, in that day when I visit, I will visit their sin on them. And then he sent a plague on the people that made the calf. So if it wasn't swept up in the 3,000 men that were killed who were the leaders, then God's plague dealt with the rest of those that were actively involved in this sin. The last part that we're going to have today is the good part. We've kind of come through the dim shadows here and the sadness of the death of all of these people. And we see the powerful justice of God and dealing with sin, and yet we see his forgiveness. But when we get to this next part, we're going to see his beauty and the glory of the glorious God. We're going to see the revelation of the covenant keeper. And this is in chapters 33, 13 through 34, 28. Moses has a question of God. And it goes like this: how can I know you better? How can I know you better? Verse 13 of chapter 33. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people. Moses is literally asking God to help him to know him better. Lord, show yourself to me. Help me to see you. Help me to understand you. Help me to know you. And that must have delighted God's heart, because over and again in the scripture, God says that's what we should glory in, that we know him and understand him. And so God makes a promise in verse 19. He says, and he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious on whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Basically, God says, I'll do it. And then he explains what the plan is going to be. And there is a plan. But, he said, verse 20 and following, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. In other words, man shall not look at me in the face and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Now, I skipped one part of the story. I just want to make a note here, where Moses came down from the mountain after God told him what the children of Israel had done. And he broke the tables out of his anger for what they had done. Now in this passage, he's back up in the mountain talking to God again. God's giving him an opportunity to cut another set of stones, and he's going to place the same messages on it and send it back down. But in the meantime, while he's up there, we have this scene. I will show myself to you, but you can't look me in the face. He said, I will cover you with my hand until I pass by. Then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Here we have three things that are really involved with the plan. First, God's going to demonstrate his glory by letting him be in the cleft of that rock and then going by and letting him see what follows him. God's giving him a new opportunity, says to Moses, go and cut 2 more stones. And then he's going to have this glorious revelation, and it's amazing. Before Moses goes back and goes down among the people, and they start over. Now, let me read what we see there in that next passage. We're in 34, verse 10 through 28, I believe. The Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, the God merciful and gracious, slow to anger. So now God is going to give him a plan of how he can know him and how he can see him. And verses 20 and following, he says, but you cannot see my face, for man cannot see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me where you can stand on the rock, and while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. This is the plan. God's going to be in a crevice in the rock, and he's going to be protected by God's hand as he goes by, and he won't be damaged by this. This is a demonstration of God's glory, and that's what Moses asked for. He's going to give him a new table of stones to take down so that they can take on the journey from there on. And then he's going to give him a glorious revelation as he goes by. As he's walking by, he's going to reveal himself. It says here, the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God and merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. Well, I went through this whole list, and it's an amazing list. First of all, I want to say, when God chose to reveal himself to Moses, you might have expected that God would do those things that would be impressive, that would be majestic, or would show his visible beauty or his glory as it shone brighter than the sun. He did none of those things.